All right, so welcome to part two of Playing with Research in Health and Physical Education special podcast linking adapted physical education. We had part one that came out last week. We partnered up with What's New in Adapted Physical Education podcast with Scott McNamara, and this is more of a panel type discussion with Terry Rizzo, Dr. Kevin Andrew Richards, and Scott McNamara, myself, Risto and so we'll just get right into there. It'll kind of pick up where the last one dropped off. So here we go with our latest episode of Playing with Research in Health and Physical Education.
I think these are awesome comments. I kind of want to, and I want to kind of start gearing us a little bit towards like the research area. But I first kind of like, what is the role of someone like Kevin, who's a general PE professor? What's his role in kind of, and what are your thoughts on like what your role is in to try to bridge this gap a little bit between APE and PE in higher ed?
I think from my perspective, and I don't have specific training and background in adaptive, I do think I have, and I think I still could teach a basic introductory course. But beyond that, I don't feel capable or prepared. But I do think that I can be an ally and an advocate. As people in our generation move through the ranks and move into, associate professor positions and eventually full professor positions and take over as editors of journals, then I think that there's gatekeeping functions that are involved in those roles. And that we need to be on the side of our allies in adapted physical education. I think that we can work together in a lot of very important ways. And from a research perspective, this is kind of how I've approached it in my work with Wes, Justin, and others. I realized at one point that there'd been a lot of work done on the socialization of physical education teachers, but virtually nothing done on the socialization of adapted physical educators. And Wes and I had this common lineage in that we both went through Purdue, he at the undergraduate level and me for my graduate work. And when he got into his PhD program at Virginia, he reached out and said, we don't really have much research in this area. How about we do some? And there's been a couple of papers that had been published prior to that. But, here you have somebody who's trained as a general physical education teacher with a specialization in a particular theory or approach. And then somebody else who has a background in adapted and knows enough about that theory and approach. And I think that we were able to kind of pull that together and do some really interesting work. So I think that part of it comes down to partnerships and working across these silos. And I don't know if I want to conceptualize necessarily PE and APE as different disciplines, but the term interdisciplinary comes to mind. Maybe there's a better way to phrase that, but just that idea that even though there are some, potentially identifiable differences between our fields or our subfields, that doesn't mean that we can't work together. And I think we just need to be intentional about that and to look out for each other when we get to positions and we have custody of some of our journals and some of our conferences and these other outlets, and finding ways to make them more integrative and inclusive. And I'm currently serving as an associate editor for the Journal of Teaching and Physical Education, for example. And I reached out when I was invited to come onto this podcast. I reached out to Mark Byra and Brian McCulloch, who are the senior and junior editors of that journal, respectively. And I said, hey, I'd like to make a statement on behalf of the journal, if that's okay with you. And they agreed. And, basically the message that I have from JTPE is that we want our journal to be inclusive and welcoming of APE focused scholarship, and hope that APE researchers will consider it as an outlet for their publications. And I think we need to make messages like that and make statements like that and make them explicit.
As somebody listening to this, you all have got it. You all are the leaders. You all can shape the future. You folks, and I know a little bit about Justin. I'm working on a chapter for a book he's putting together for APE. Y'all have got some great skills. Yeah, you have a choice, really. You and many others like you across the country. you got a choice. Are you going to be servants to this thing that's been around here now for, 50, 60 years? Or you're going to be architects of something new. Yeah. You all have it. Stay with it. Just do it. Hearing about JTPE, that's music to my ears, because APAC, I was editor of that journal. And I could tell you, when I picked it up for several years after I did my editor term, I was reading stuff in there. I'm going, okay, OT, PT. And that's okay, because I know adapted physical educators, we take that seriously. And APAC is a great journal. Except, what happened to physical education and adapted physical education in public schools? You don't see much of it. Although Jeff Martin's seeing more of it now, because you've got new young people coming out doing great things, whether it's in social justice, social capabilities, a lot of different areas. Y'all need to just take over and do it. Don't hesitate. You do it.
All I would add to that is yes, I agree with everything that you're saying there. But I also think that in addition to us as faculty members working in this direction, I think we also need to be aware of and find ways to address the structural disconnects between our disciplines. And I think about what we have here at Illinois. I think we have a good undergraduate teacher education program, but we only have one class in adapted, and it's taught by somebody who does not have an adapted background. We do not, anybody on faculty here in my department who has a background in adapted physical education. Now, we have people who study disability, and we actually have one of the best disability resource centers in the country that's
yes.
our college, and that's something that we're very, very proud of. But I look at the adapted physical education class, and for the last 20 years, it's been taught by somebody who I'm sure does a great job with it. He gets the students out and has them in field experiences, but he does not have training in adapted, as far as I'm aware.
Well, myself, we in my university, we have one class as well, in a dedicated AP, and I am, that's my background. And I will say, even, with the training, if I have one class, and the amount of disabilities that I want to cover, and I can only cover visual impairments or deaf and hard and hearing for one class or maybe two, it's not very sufficient as far as time goes to really, prepare somebody to work with someone with a visual impairment or whatever disability it is. When I'm given this very, very finite amount of time to teach them about an entire disability and all the teaching strategies and all the research that has gone on in that area. I mean, it's
impossible. It's absolutely impossible. And, and I think about how adapted physical education teachers have to work across students, a variety of different students who have very specific and unique needs. And, even within a disability category, not all students with autism spectrum disorder, for example, present the same way. You have wide variety, and being able to learn how to adapt content specifically for their individual needs is a skill. And I do agree that adapting content to meet individual needs is something that all physical educators should do, regardless of whether or not they're adapted or physical education generalists.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, how hard is it to get a job in adapted PE? Is there a huge need for adapted PE professors? Are the jobs getting filled by people who are getting a traditional pedagogy degree but doing some overlap in adapted PE and then jumping into adapted PE jobs? What's the job market like in higher education?
All I know is talking to some colleagues that have been tracking it, and I know that there's been some papers put out, but it's been a little while since then. But I know somebody's tracking it right now, and basically every APE position that comes out in higher ed gets filled by an APE person, and then a lot of times, we're very attractive as well in a general PE position, which is what I'm in. I'm in a general PE position where I teach one AP class. So I think in higher ed now, as far as teachers go, I think it's still very attractive now. It depends a lot on state to state, what that looks like. And, the programs that are around is very state to state. Where I'm at in Iowa, it's not too much of a need, but in California, Wisconsin, Minnesota, much higher need there. But Terry, you can go on there.
What I was going to say is, you need a split screen here to deal with all these issues, right? The higher ed issue is critical because, and that's when we started out this conversation, in a department, especially if you've been to American Kinesiology Association meetings recently, the dominance of exercise science because of enrollments is almost overwhelming other areas within the discipline. And that is not a good thing. And so it influences your decision when you post a position. People just may not even advertise the need for an adapted physical education specialist. You'll have a department just literally write it off. In California, though, we've got probably 4 or 5 schools that come to mind that eliminated or suspended their pedagogy program. Yet, when the silver tsunami strikes, they're all going to be on the bandwagon going, let's resurrect our program, and there's not going to be anybody to fill it. It's almost like, where are you going to find PhD candidates in pedagogy? How many schools are Ohio State saved their program. Purdue lost theirs. I mean, losing someone with Tom Templin's program, that's disgraceful. You got a guy, you got a gem, and you let that go? So that's a big problem you all are addressing. We shouldn't be losing our pedagogy programs at the PhD level at major universities, and we should be bringing in adaptive people. And if we could blend it together, that would be great because that's reality.
Yep. I love the shout out to Tom Templin. He was my advisor. He's a good man.
He's first class guy.
Absolutely, in every way imaginable. But what I've seen some postings, and I think the way that some adapted folks can really position themselves well when it comes to higher ed jobs, and this is just my opinion, is if you have people who have kind of a little bit of a background in both, and I think Wes Wilson is a good example of this. He did his undergraduate in physical education and then his master's and PhD in adapted, and when he was looking for jobs, he could look for adapted jobs, but he could also look for straight pedagogy jobs, PE pedagogy jobs. And then he could position himself as, hey, if I come in here and you hire me, then I can teach your adapted classes. And I'd love to hire somebody with a background like that here at Illinois if we had a posting, because they can come in and they can develop community programs, they can teach adapted physical education coursework, and they can also contribute to the PE side of things.
You're exactly right. You know what's funny? When I was at Illinois as a PhD candidate, my training was in kines, in special ed, and in psychology. While I was there, I interviewed with Mike Luvis and a guy named John Taylor. You'd have to be around there a long time to remember those names. Luvis left for Cleveland State because he knew he wasn't going to get tenure. Taylor left for Bureau of Education for the Handicapped, and they became a dean at Arizona. They filled in the position with John Luco, Canadian adapted PE. He didn't get tenure. Then they filled the position with a guy named Walt Davis, and there were some crazy things. He didn't even get a chance to go up for review. He was gone. They turned to me and they said, we had a big grant at the time about mainstreaming. And they said, well, the person who was department head at the time was a guy named Raleigh Wright. Great guy. Raleigh came by and he said, look, we could bump your salary up. You teach the undergraduate class, run the grant, this and that. It'll all be good. Then after I finished, I did a postdoc there, and they were still looking for someone then. My point, if they're not going to be dedicated to this field, you're going to keep getting this issue coming up in your face. And you're talking about some of the first-rate universities in the United States. I'm going to show my bias here. Purdue, Illinois, Penn State. Ohio. These are, and not that the others aren't, but these were, my day, world-class places. You got to commit to this because you don't even have to feel good about the profession, right? Adapted. You just look at what's going on in schools. Try to catch up with reality and prepare people for reality. It'll be different, but recognizing that and getting people to, if you will, appreciate what we do. Well, that's what you all can do. You all are leaders. Here, look at it. Look at it another way, right? If you don't do it this way, it's sort of like, hating whales and joining Greenpeace. What? Would you really do that? I don't know what it's going to take. But I do know folks like you all have to stand your ground and shape the future.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most important things about having this conversation is so that for us and for folks who are listening to the podcast or who will be listening to the podcast, I think it's just important that we remember that in a lot of ways we're in this together. We're working towards the same broad goals of influencing children's physical education or physical activity, whether that be children with or without disabilities, and we can learn from and help each other in a lot of ways. So it doesn't make sense for one discipline that's marginalized to marginalize another discipline.
Good point.
So, I mean, I think we kind of addressed a lot of the issues. Just one, like real quick, I think we should start kind of wrapping up. But like, as far as the research stuff goes, going back to that, I mean, what are some solutions? I think we've talked a lot about the barriers and stuff, and I think broadly we've talked about some solutions. But how can we like kind of promote interdisciplinary actions between our general PE researchers and our APE researchers?
So, here's another thing that I can throw out there. So Risto and I are both involved with the SIG, the Special Interest Group at the American Educational Research Association, that's called Research on Learning and Instruction in Physical Education. And historically, we haven't had a very strong adapted physical education presence there. And I think that's something that we need to rectify, and we need to invite in those folks to have a seat at the table. Sometimes I think it goes beyond just forwarding an email about a conference or about submitting articles to a journal. I think that sometimes you have to really go out there and reach out to individual people and invite them in and show them that you want them at the party, and then hopefully it'll snowball from there. And so I've had some conversations with some adapted folks about maybe trying to come to AERA. Maybe we get a symposium or a couple of presentations. We host a more informal event that we call an Invisible College before the start of the conference. Maybe we get some adapted folks in there and just start having those conversations.
I think that's a great idea. We can give a plug out right now. The window closes for abstracts late July, and then the conference is in beautiful San Francisco in April. So we typically have our Invisible College on what will look like most likely on the 16th and 17th of April next year, which is more of an informal idea, kind of outside the box thinking. And I think if there's a group that comes together to have this conversation, who are doing research in adapted PE, to have this exact same conversation with the people in the room who are doing research and asking, how can we work together? How can we, break down these silos? I think that's a perfect venue to do it. And then the conference goes on that rest of that week. It's a 3-4 day conference, some of the best pedagogy stuff, and not just in PE, obviously, just in greater pedagogy. It's an amazing conference. So I think that's a great place. And I love what you said, Kevin, earlier about being an ally and an advocate. In my specific line of research, I haven't done anything in adapted PE, but having these conversations makes me think, hey, is there an angle here how I can bring in somebody who does adapted PE and, write a grant together or align with, another piece of my research with this, I almost wanted to say other field, which is not, but that's how my mindset has been. I'm looking down, I'm like, okay, I got to get tenure. I got to do these things. These are my research agendas. And I do think that sometimes it's easier to do it as an associate in full when you're kind of taking a breath and reassessing what do you want to do and thinking broader.
What you just touched on there, Risto, is one of the structural issues that I was alluding to before. The nature of higher education, the nature of academia pushes us as early career scholars to not only focus within our discipline, but focus within a very narrow aspect of our discipline. And so I study socialization. I don't know very much at all about physical activity. I value it in a sense, but I don't do it or know much about it. And then if you extend even a step further out and think about, well, how about the relationship between PE and APE? I think for a lot of folks, the structure of academia itself prevents that thought and those conversations. And it goes back to that notion that we just need to be intentional about it.
Scott, Risto, Kevin, you're in the driver's seat. Drive. Change the culture of these programs that you're working in and living in right now. Don't settle, because what I'm hearing from you three, I've been hearing my whole career. And it's really sad to hear that we haven't changed. You need to change the culture, because if you don't, it's tantamount to negligence. You guys can do it. You're a good core of leaders. Get it done. Stay with it. Do whatever it takes. We need you. Really, the future needs you guys.
Yeah, and I think that this, and hopefully, one of the things that's nice about recording this as a podcast is that folks outside of the four of us will listen, and it'll kind of spark them to think about it a little bit more, maybe change the way that they approach their work a little. But I really like the idea of extending out and using this podcast not as an endpoint, but as a starting point to have additional conversations like the one that the four of us are having in larger venues with other people across. I think it's important to get early career scholars like the three of us engaged, but senior scholars in many ways are the stewards of our discipline. And so until they retire or transition out of academia, in a lot of ways they serve as gatekeepers. They have custody of our journals. They have custody of our conferences. So yes, early career scholars need to get on board, because one day we will be in that position, and we need to be active and we need to be advocates. It's across the career cycle.
Yeah, and I love the fact that what you said about JTPE wanting this type of research and being inclusive. I think, those are very senior scholars in our field, and talking about being inclusive and having this, adapted PE stuff, across the board coming in. And I think that's important. But I also think that we need people to remind us to think more broadly. Look, I mean, when we started this podcast, we were 15 episodes in or something, and Kevin called me and he's like, "Hey, we haven't highlighted a single adapted PE piece." I'm like, "Oh, I didn't think about that. Like, I didn't really reflect on it. I was just busy trying to get, podcasts out." And then I met Justin Hagel, and what a tremendous scholar. Like, just
he's really good. He's really good. Yep.
The stuff that he's done and the volume that he produces is tremendous, and
yes,
really interesting, good scholarship. So it's great to highlight his work, and we're going to have him on. He publishes enough papers every year that we can just kind of pick one from a hat and it'll be good.
I think we probably have enough to wrap up. I mean, this is obviously a humongous topic that we could talk about forever, as well as I don't think we have like the steps that we need, which would be a great research endeavor to really find out what are the steps that we need to be an ally, to be an advocate on both sides of the aisle to bridge this gap. And I don't know if that exists, and I don't know how to quite get there, but I mean, I think we can kind of wrap this conversation up for the moment.
Yeah.
And I would say, I'll give a shameless plug here. If you're on Scott's podcast, listen to this, look us up, Playing with Research on Health and PE, where everywhere you can find a podcast, you can listen to it on your computer at anchor.fm, or you can do it on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. We put out an episode every single Tuesday at 7 a.m. Eastern, like clockwork comes out. And also, if you're on our podcast, you should check out Scott's. He has some really, really good flowing conversations and a lot of good information if you're interested in adaptive PE, or maybe you're just not knowledgeable enough on it yet to get some really good information on there. He's had some tremendous people on that podcast.
Thank you for the plug. And yes, I don't do every week. Mine's a lot more sporadic. So, but yeah.
Well, we have a team of 5, so it's easier to do it every week.
I didn't know that. Now I don't feel bad. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Well done, guys. Nice to meet you all.